My daughter had perfect manners, so I called the police. I was picking up my daughter from my mom's house when she handed me a folder. CPS came by yesterday. You have an emergency hearing on Monday. My stomach dropped. What? That's impossible. For child abandonment. I ripped open the folder. Emergency custody petition. Mom, what did you tell them? That's when Emma emerged in the doorway with perfect posture. Good evening, Mother. Thank you for retrieving me. I froze. This was the same child who called butterflies flutterbys last week. I reached for her, but she stayed rigid. You abandoned me for 3 days. You always leave me. Grandmother takes care of me. Her voice was flat and trained. I helped her become a woman. My mother smiled. See you in court. I carried Emma to the car, my mind racing. I had 72 hours to prove she was brainwashed, or I would lose her to the system. When Emma buckled her seatbelt, I saw them. Purple rings around both wrists. Emma, what happened? Grandmother says good girls don't complain about necessary corrections. At home, Emma stood in the corner facing the wall. Sweetie, you can sit down. She didn't move. I haven't finished my reflection time. Her little voice cracked. What's reflection time? She went quiet and her whole body started to shake. I pulled her into my arms, but she went rigid again, whispering numbers. 97, 98, 99. Why are you counting? I have to reach the number or I go back to the special room. The words barely left her mouth when she wet herself. Right there in my arms. 5 years old and shaking with terror. After I cleaned her up, she went back to counting. I was Googling emergency therapists when my neighbor Carol called. She lived next to my mother for 20 years. I don't want to be a curious George, but I thought I'd let you know that I heard your Emma counting from the basement Thursday night for hours. Just numbers echoing up through the windows. I thanked her and hung up. 55 hours left. The next morning, Emma refused to eat breakfast. Only good girls who finish their lessons get food. I drove straight to my mother's house. Every second mattered. She was gardening, humming like nothing happened. What's the special room? She smiled without looking up. Children have such wild imaginations. She's traumatized. What did you do? I improved her. Most people pay good money for that kind of transformation. You're welcome. She finally met my eyes. Little brats become perfect girls with the right methods. You trained her to lie. I trained her to tell the truth. Good girls don't tell stories. She returned to her roses. See you Monday. Don't be late. Again. The rest of the day was hell. I took time off work to talk to Emma, but she wouldn't break from her script. CPS wouldn't return my calls. 40 hours left. That night, Emma went to bed sitting upright, still counting. I dozed off in the chair beside her. It was 2 a.m. when she started screaming. Please, I counted to 10,000. I counted all the way. Please let me out. It's dark. But she wasn't in bed anymore. I ran down to the basement where I found her standing in the corner. This is where the special room is at grandmother's. She pointed at the wall. But we can't open it. Only grandmother opens it. I love grandmother. She takes care of me when you abandon me. I wanted to tear my hair out. I booked an emergency therapist the next morning, but evaluations take weeks. She couldn't testify by Monday. I tried recording Emma, insisted that it was a safe space, that I loved her, but she just repeated her script. You abandoned me. Over and over, dead-eyed. I drove back to my mother's with my phone recording. Tell me what you did to her. Within minutes, the police were escorting me off the property for harassment. She waved from her porch. 12 hours, tick-tock. I was out of options, out of time. I called my brother Marcus, who worked in special forces. 10 years of making terrorists talk. I need your help. He knew enough about our mother not to ask questions. Just responded with OMW. Marcus arrived with 2 others I recognized from his unit. We drove separate cars. The spare key was still under her fake rock. Marcus hand-signaled his team. And at 2 a.m., 7 hours before court, my mother woke to 3 men in tactical gear surrounding her bed. Marcus zip-tied her wrists while she sputtered about assault charges. They carried her to her own basement, to the locked door Emma feared. Marcus set up his camera. Her face went white. You have 6 hours to explain everything you did to Emma, starting with day 1, hour 1. His hand moved to the doorknob. What's in this room that makes children count to 10,000? She was shaking now, eyes locked on that door. Please. The woman who'd smiled in her garden yesterday was sobbing. 6 hours until court. Start talking. She stayed silent. He picked the lock. Click. The door swung inward and the smell hit me first. Something like old sweat mixed with cleaning products and fear. Marcus aimed his flashlight into the darkness and I saw it all at once. A room no bigger than a closet with concrete walls covered in scratch marks. Thousands of tiny lines grouped in sets of 5. The digital timer bolted to the wall still glowed red with 10,000 frozen on its display. A drain sat in the center of the floor with dark stains around it that made my stomach turn. My mother started sobbing harder behind us as Marcus stepped inside with his camera running. He moved slowly, recording every inch while I stood frozen in the doorway. The walls had more than just tally marks. Words were scratched into the concrete too. I am a good girl, appeared over and over in shaky child handwriting. Marcus found a shelf with a thick ledger and opened it carefully. My mother's neat cursive filled page after page with dates and times and lessons. Day 1. Emma must learn that good girls stay silent, was the first entry from 3 days ago. Marcus filmed each page while I read over his shoulder, recognizing phrases Emma had been repeating. Good girls don't complain about necessary corrections, appeared on page 2 with detailed instructions about wrist restraints. The timer had a control panel beside it with buttons labeled in my mother's handwriting. Start counting and reset at failure, and add 1,000 for talking back, were written on tape beside each button. Metal restraints were bolted to the floor near the drain, sized for small wrists. Purple fabric was still stuck to the metal where it had rubbed against skin. I took photos with my phone, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. Marcus found more ledgers on the shelf, older ones with different names on the covers. One had my name from 30 years ago. I opened it and saw the same lessons, the same phrases, the same systematic breaking down of a child. A memory crashed into me so hard I had to grab the doorframe. I was 4 years old in a dark room just like this one. counting and counting while my voice got weaker. My mother had been outside gardening, humming church songs while I screamed numbers at concrete walls. I'd buried it so deep I'd convinced myself it was just a bad dream. But here was the proof in her own handwriting. Marcus kept recording while his team member checked his watch and tapped his wrist. We had maybe an hour before neighbors would wake up and see strange cars in the driveway. My mother was still crying and begging, but Marcus ignored her completely. We gathered the ledgers and I took more photos of the room from every angle. The other team members zip-tied my mother's ankles too, and they carried her out to one of their cars. Marcus promised they wouldn't hurt her but would keep her away from phones until after court. I grabbed Emma's ledger and the one with my name and ran to my car. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I called Dr. Howe's emergency number from the car and left a message explaining I needed an urgent exam for Emma. He called back within 5 minutes and agreed to see us at 7, just 2 hours before the hearing. Relief washed over me, but I knew we still had so much to prove. My phone buzzed with a text from Georgia Cantrell, the family lawyer I'd messaged earlier. She could meet us at the hospital after Emma's exam, but warned me to be careful about what evidence I shared. She said anything obtained illegally couldn't be used in court. I wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. I had proof of systematic child abuse, but might not be able to use it. I drove home and sat in my driveway for a minute, trying to calm down before going inside. It was almost 6 in the morning and I needed to wake Emma soon. I found her curled up in her bed, lips moving silently in her sleep. 4,847, 4,848, 4,849. Her little voice was hoarse from counting all night. I sat on her bed and rubbed her back gently until she opened her eyes. She immediately started counting out loud, and I helped her get dressed while she continued. 5,012, 5,013. I made her toast, but she wouldn't eat it. We got in the car and she sat perfectly still in her booster seat. Every time the turn signal clicked, she flinched and whispered under her breath, "Good girls don't complain. Good girls don't complain." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The pediatrician's office was 20 minutes away, but it felt like hours. Emma counted the whole way there, starting over at 1 when she reached 6,000. Dr. Howe was waiting for us in the parking lot and led us straight to an exam room. He was gentle with Emma but thorough, taking photos of her wrists from every angle. He documented her rigid posture and how she wouldn't make eye contact. When he asked her questions, she only gave the same scripted responses about being abandoned. He pulled me into the hallway while his nurse stayed with Emma. "I have to report this to CPS immediately," he said quietly. Something feels off about how quickly Marcus and his team moved on the mother. 3 special forces guys doing a middle-of-the-night operation in suburbia? The timing seems awfully convenient, arriving just when needed and finding that hidden room so easily. Part of me was terrified, but another part felt validated that someone else could see what had been done to her. Dr. Howe printed out his report and handed me a copy while Emma sat on the exam table, still counting softly under her breath. We walked out to the parking lot where a woman in a gray suit was leaning against a Honda Civic checking her phone. She looked up and stuck out her hand. "Georgia Cantrell, you must be Emma's mom." I nodded and shook her hand while Emma stood rigid beside me. Georgia glanced at the medical report I was holding and asked if she could see it. She scanned it quickly, her eyes moving fast over the pages. "We have about 90 minutes before court. We need to build a defense that focuses only on what we can legally prove." She looked at Emma, who was staring at the ground and counting. "No mention of anything that happened last night. Nothing about how you discovered what you discovered. We work with what we have." I buckled Emma into her car seat while Georgia got into her Honda and followed us to the police station. Inside the station, the desk officer gave me forms to fill out for a child abuse report. I wrote carefully about Emma's bruises and her behaviors and what the doctor found. I didn't write anything about the special room or how I knew about it. The officer read my statement and shook his head. "These investigations take weeks, sometimes months. This won't help you for tomorrow." Georgia stood beside me and nodded like she expected this. We walked back to the parking lot where Georgia pulled me aside near her car. "Listen, I know you have video evidence. I can see it on your face. But we can't use it. Anything obtained through breaking and entering is inadmissible." She saw my face fall. "We have Emma's behaviors, the medical evidence, and we'll get witness testimony. That has to be enough." She pulled out her phone and made a call to the Child Advocacy Center. They had an opening for a forensic interview at 3 o'clock. Georgia warned me it probably wouldn't be done in time for the morning hearing, but we had to try. The system moved slow, but every piece of evidence mattered. I drove to Carol's house with Georgia following. Carol was waiting on her porch with a notebook in her hand. She'd already started writing down what she remembered. Georgia sat with her at the kitchen table and helped her write out a formal statement about hearing Emma counting from the basement window on Thursday night. Carol signed it, and Georgia notarized it with a stamp from her briefcase. One piece of independent evidence secured. Back at my house, Georgia helped me write my own affidavit. I sat at my kitchen table while Emma stood in the corner of the living room counting. Georgia asked me questions and typed on her laptop. I admitted I'd been late picking Emma up from my mother's house before because of work. Sometimes 30 minutes once an hour, but never days. Never abandonment. Georgia helped me word everything carefully to own my imperfections without admitting to false accusations. We walked a careful line between truth and protecting ourselves. My phone rang while Georgia was printing out the affidavit. The caller ID showed the police department. Georgia grabbed the phone from my hand before I could answer. "This is Georgia Cantrell, attorney for Emma's mother." "Yes, Detective McCabe. My client will be available for an interview tomorrow afternoon after the custody hearing." "No, not before then. Thank you." She hung up and looked at me. "Your mother filed an assault complaint. We knew this was coming." My hands started shaking. Georgia sat me down and explained my rights. "If anyone asks about last night, you invoke your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. But better yet, we avoid the question entirely." She had me practice saying one sentence over and over. "I was home with my daughter." I said it 20 times until it sounded natural even though my voice shook. "That's all you say if pressed. You were home with Emma. Nothing else." She made me say it again. At 3 o'clock we drove to the Child Advocacy Center, but the forensic interviewer was running behind. We waited in the lobby for an hour while Emma sat perfectly still beside me. When they finally called us back, the interviewer explained she could only do a preliminary assessment today. The full interview would take multiple sessions. Emma went into the room alone while I watched through a one-way mirror. She answered every question with her script about being abandoned. The interviewer noted Emma's dissociation and rigid responses in her report, but said she couldn't determine the cause without more sessions. We left with another partial piece of evidence. Georgia drove me home and said she'd file all our documents with the court before they closed. She'd meet us at the courthouse at 8:30 tomorrow morning. After she left, I tried to get Emma to eat dinner, but she refused. Good girls earn their food. She stood in her usual corner counting. At 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Marilyn Estrada from CPS stood on my porch with a clipboard. I'm here for the emergency home visit based on Dr. Howe's report. I let her in even though my stomach was in knots. Emma was on the couch now, sitting with perfect posture and counting softly. 412, 413. Marilyn sat in the chair across from her and watched. She wrote notes on her clipboard about Emma's counting and rigid posture. She took photos of Emma's room with her phone. She asked Emma gentle questions but got the same robotic responses about being a good girl and not complaining. After an hour of observation, Marilyn packed up her things. I'll have my preliminary report ready for court tomorrow. There are clear signs of trauma here. She looked at Emma, who was still counting. Whatever happened to her, she needs help. After Marilyn left, I sat next to Emma on the couch, but she scooted away and kept counting. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an email from Dr. Howe's office. I opened the attachment while Emma ate dry cereal one piece at a time, still counting between bites. The report said the bruises matched restraint patterns, but couldn't identify who made them. My hands shook as I forwarded it to Georgia, who texted back that it was enough to raise concerns, even if it wasn't everything we needed. Emma finished exactly 20 pieces of cereal and pushed the bowl away. I drove her to the Child Advocacy Center for the forensic interview Georgia had scheduled. The building looked like a regular house from outside with toys in the windows. Emma walked beside me with perfect posture and her hands folded. The interviewer was a woman with gray hair who spoke softly to Emma while I watched from another room through a mirror. Emma sat rigid in the small chair and answered every question with the same flat voice about being abandoned. When the interviewer asked about the special room, Emma's eyes went blank and she stared at the wall for 30 seconds before continuing to count. The interviewer wrote notes about dissociation and trauma indicators, but said she needed more sessions to understand what happened. We left with another partial report that proved something was wrong, but not who did it. Back home, Marilyn called and asked if she could stop by with some information. She arrived 20 minutes later and sat at my kitchen table while Emma stood in her corner. Marilyn pulled out a folder and showed me 2 previous complaints about my mother from years ago. One from my cousin in 2018, and another from my aunt in 2015. Both were marked unsubstantiated because the kids wouldn't talk. The pattern was right there in black and white, but CPS had never connected the dots. Georgia came over that evening after Emma was in bed. She studied the video on my phone that Marcus had taken, pausing to write down specific phrases from the ledger my mother kept. She explained we couldn't use the video in court, but we could use what we learned from it to ask the right questions. She wrote down each phrase Emma had been repeating and matched them to entries in my mother's handwriting. After Georgia left, I sat alone at midnight watching the video again. The ledger showed dates going back 3 weeks with detailed notes about Emma's training sessions. Each entry matched word for word what Emma had been saying. My mother had written about counting exercises and food restrictions, and something called posture practice. The rage built in my chest as I read about timed isolation periods that increased from 1 hour to 6 hours over the days. I wanted to submit this video so badly, but I knew it would destroy our case if the break-in came out. Georgia had been clear that illegally obtained evidence would make me look unstable, and could cost me Emma forever. I deleted the video from my phone but kept screenshots of the most important pages hidden in a locked folder. The next morning, I checked Facebook and found my mother had posted 12 photos of Emma at church events over the past year. Emma looked happy in every photo with big smiles that I now realized were forced. My mother had written captions about being a loving grandmother who stepped up when her daughter couldn't handle parenting. Georgia screenshot everything and warned me this was the start of a media campaign to make my mother look like the stable caregiver. That afternoon, Georgia asked me to tell her everything about my own childhood. I hadn't planned to bring it up, but the words came out anyway. I told her about being locked in a dark closet when I was 4, counting to stay calm while my mother went shopping. I remembered the hunger when she decided I hadn't earned meals. I remembered the perfect posture training and the scripts I had to memorize about being grateful. Georgia listened without judgment, and explained that my history would actually strengthen our case by showing a pattern of abuse across generations. Georgia seems oddly prepared for every single move here, like she's done this exact dance before, knowing about the video evidence before anyone mentions it, having that notarizer ready in her briefcase, cutting off the detective mid-call. She said testifying about it would be hard, but it might be the thing that saves Emma. She helped me see that this wasn't about proving I was perfect, but about keeping Emma safe. The court didn't need a perfect mother, just one who wouldn't hurt her child. She explained that my work schedule and occasional lateness picking Emma up were normal parent struggles, nothing like the systematic abuse my mother had done. We spent 2 hours going through every piece of evidence we had, and every witness who could testify. Carol would talk about the counting she heard. Dr. Howe would present the medical evidence. The forensic interviewer would discuss Emma's trauma responses. Marilyn would share the pattern of previous complaints. Georgia would tie it all together to show Emma was in danger with my mother. Then Georgia's phone rang and she put it on speaker. The court clerk was calling to tell us our case had been assigned to Judge Harrison. Georgia's face tightened as she thanked the clerk and hung up. She explained that Harrison was known for keeping families together whenever possible. He rarely removed kids from grandparents and needed overwhelming evidence to act. We would have to adjust our entire strategy for a judge who would start out thinking grandmothers don't hurt grandchildren. Georgia stayed until 11 that night reworking our approach. The next morning my phone rang at 7:30, and a man introduced himself as Anton Fowler, the guardian ad litem assigned to Emma's case. He explained he'd be at the hearing to observe Emma and make an independent recommendation to the judge about her best interests. His voice was calm and professional as he asked a few basic questions about Emma's current state. I told him about the counting and the rigid behaviors while Emma sat at the kitchen table arranging her cereal pieces in perfect rows. He said he'd watch for those behaviors at court, and asked me to bring Emma early, so he could observe her in the waiting area. After I hung up, Detective McCabe called again about my mother's assault complaint from the break-in she suspected had happened. Georgia took my phone immediately and told him any interview would have to wait until after the custody hearing this morning. She scheduled it for tomorrow afternoon and reminded him that I'd be represented by counsel during any questioning. The detective wasn't happy but agreed to the delay since the custody matter took precedence. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus saying he wanted to post the video online to expose what our mother had done to Emma. I typed back immediately that absolutely not. We couldn't risk anything that might jeopardize the custody case. He sent 3 more messages arguing that people needed to know what she was capable of doing to children. I called him and told him to delete the video from all his devices right now. He finally agreed, but I could hear the frustration in his voice as he promised to stay quiet until after court. Georgia picked us up at 8:15 and drove us to the courthouse in her car since she wanted to review strategy on the way. Emma sat in the back seat counting softly while we went over the evidence one more time. When we arrived at the courthouse, Emma's counting suddenly sped up as we rode the escalator, and its mechanical rhythm matched her numbers. The metal steps clicked in time with her voice as she hit 200, then 300, going faster and faster. I quickly guided her to a quiet corner near the water fountain and pulled up a white noise app on my phone. The steady static sound broke the pattern, and Emma's counting slowed as she focused on the new sound instead. I remembered what Dr. Howe had suggested about grounding techniques, and started having Emma name things she could see in the hallway. She pointed at a painting, then a bench, then a plant, and her counting dropped from the thousands down to 98, 97, 96. Anton Fowler appeared beside us, and I saw him writing notes about Emma's behavior and my response to it. He gave me a small nod when Emma's counting dropped below 50, and seemed to calm down slightly. Georgia rushed to the clerk's office with our emergency exhibits just 8 minutes before our hearing time. She handed over the medical photos of Emma's wrists, Carol's signed statement about the counting, and the preliminary notes from CPS. The clerk stamped each document and added them to our file while Georgia watched to make sure everything was properly recorded. She came back looking relieved that we'd gotten our evidence submitted in time for the judge to review it. In the hallway outside the courtroom, a woman with 2 young kids were trying to keep them occupied with coloring books. One of the children asked Emma if she wanted to color too and held out a crayon toward her. Emma stood perfectly straight and said, "Good girls don't play with toys during important times," in that flat voice. The little boy looked confused and his mother pulled him back while Anton wrote more notes about Emma's response. He asked Emma what she meant by good girls, and she just repeated the phrase 3 more times without any emotion. The bailiff called our case number and we filed into the courtroom where my mother already sat with her lawyer at the other table. Judge Harrison entered and immediately laid out the rules for today's emergency hearing about immediate safety and temporary custody only. He said we weren't here to litigate the full case, but only to determine where Emma should stay while the investigation continued. My mother sat across the courtroom with perfect posture and a small smile while her lawyer organized papers on their table. Marilyn Estrada took the stand first as the CPS investigator who had done the emergency home visit 2 nights ago. She described finding Emma counting continuously in the corner of my living room and her rigid obedience to invisible rules. She testified about Emma's scripted phrases and flat emotional responses that suggested coaching or conditioning had occurred. She told the judge she was recommending continued investigation with immediate safety measures to protect Emma from further psychological harm. Her professional opinion was that Emma showed clear signs of trauma that needed immediate intervention regardless of the source. Dr. Howe came to the stand next, carrying a folder with the photos he'd taken of Emma's wrists during the examination. He showed the judge the purple bruising patterns and explained they were consistent with restraint marks from something like zip ties or rope. He described Emma's fear response when offered food and her insistence that only good girls who finished lessons could eat. He testified about her rigid posture and reluctance to sit even when invited to do so during the exam. He explained that in his medical opinion, Emma had experienced systematic conditioning that created specific behavioral responses to normal situations. The judge studied the photos carefully and asked Dr. Howe if he could determine who had caused these injuries. Dr. Howe said he couldn't identify a specific person, but the injuries were definitely inflicted rather than accidental. He added that Emma's psychological symptoms suggested prolonged exposure to whatever conditioning methods had been used on her. The forensic interviewer from the Child Advocacy Center took the stand next and opened her folder while adjusting her glasses. She described meeting Emma just yesterday afternoon and watching her count to 300 before even acknowledging anyone was in the room. She showed the judge her notes about Emma's flat voice when repeating phrases about being a good girl who doesn't complain. She explained how Emma went completely still when asked about the special room, her eyes going blank like she wasn't even there anymore. The interviewer said this kind of shutting down happens when kids experience something their minds can't handle. She testified that Emma showed clear signs of being coached to say specific things, but couldn't identify who did the coaching. She pointed to her report where she'd written that Emma displayed multiple trauma indicators, including rigid body language and scripted responses. The judge made notes while she explained that psychological harm had definitely occurred based on Emma's behaviors. Georgia handed the clerk Carol's written statement to be read into the record next. The clerk read Carol's words about living next to my mother's house for 20 years, and hearing Emma counting from the basement window last Thursday night. Carol had written that the counting went on for at least 3 hours, just numbers echoing up through the windows in Emma's little voice. She described hearing the numbers reach into the thousands, and wondering if she should call someone but not knowing what to say. The judge's face changed slightly when the clerk read the part about the counting coming from the basement specifically. His pen stopped moving and he looked up from his notes for the first time since the hearing started. My mother's lawyer stood up and straightened his tie before presenting their side of the story. He pulled out work records showing all the times I'd been late picking Emma up from my mother's house. He showed the judge my time cards from the restaurant where I worked double shifts most weekends. He read statements from people at my mother's church talking about what a wonderful woman she was with children. The church ladies had written about her patience and dedication to raising kids with proper manners and respect. He argued that I was an unstable parent who prioritized work over my daughter and relied on my elderly mother for free childcare. He suggested that Emma's behaviors were just a child's imagination running wild after being coached by me to lie about her loving grandmother. He showed photos of Emma at church events looking clean and well-dressed beside my mother. Carol's statement places Emma counting in the basement for hours, which makes me wonder why my mother would have Emma down there at all. The church photos showing Emma, clean and well-dressed, feel carefully staged when compared to how she acts now with all this rigid behavior and counting. Georgia called me to the stand, and my legs felt weak as I walked to the witness chair. I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth while Emma sat in the back row still counting under her breath. Georgia asked me about my work schedule, and I admitted that yes, I worked long hours to keep a roof over our heads. I explained that being a single mom meant making hard choices, but I'd never abandoned Emma for days like my mother claimed. I described finding Emma with bruises on her wrists and her terror about the special room. I told the judge about Emma wetting herself from fear and refusing to eat unless she was a good girl. My voice shook, but I kept going, explaining how she stood in corners for hours doing something called reflection time. I described her counting to 10,000 and the way she went rigid when I tried to hug her. The opposing lawyer stood up for cross-examination and immediately brought up my visit to my mother's house. He asked if I'd gone there and accused her of harming Emma, which I confirmed I had. He suggested I was harassing an elderly woman who'd done nothing but help raise my child. I stayed calm and explained that I only wanted to understand what had happened to make Emma so scared. I told him I knocked on the door and asked my mother directly what the special room was. When she wouldn't answer and called the police, I left immediately without any argument or scene. The lawyer pressed harder, asking if I'd been escorted off the property by police for harassment. I clarified that yes, police had asked me to leave and I'd done so right away without any resistance. I explained that my only concern was getting help for Emma and understanding her trauma responses. He tried to make it sound like I was unstable, but I kept my answers short and factual. Judge Harrison turned to Anton Fowler and asked for his recommendation as the court-appointed guardian for Emma's interests. The whole courtroom went quiet as Anton stood up from his seat in the gallery, where he'd been taking notes. He walked to the podium carrying his folder full of observations from today's hearing. He described watching Emma in the hallway, telling another child that good girls don't play during important times. He'd noted her rigid posture and the way she counted continuously, even while other witnesses testified. He told the judge he'd observed clear signs of conditioning, including scripted phrases and fear-based responses. He recommended that Emma stay with me during the investigation, with no unsupervised contact between Emma and my mother. He explained that removing Emma from my care would cause additional trauma given her current psychological state. He emphasized that Emma needed stability and therapeutic intervention, not more disruption to her life. The judge looked at both tables and then at Emma still sitting in the back row with perfect posture. He said he had serious concerns about both households, but Emma's immediate safety had to come first. He noted that this was only a temporary decision while the full investigation continued over the coming weeks. He ordered that I would maintain temporary custody with strict conditions including therapy for Emma and cooperation with CPS. He suspended my mother's visitation rights completely pending the investigation's outcome except for supervised visits at a neutral location if recommended by Emma's therapist. He scheduled a review hearing in 30 days to assess Emma's progress and review the investigation findings. Relief flooded through my body, but I knew this was just the beginning of a long fight ahead. Judge Harrison started listing the conditions while I held Emma's hand tighter. He ordered immediate therapy starting this week with a court-approved child psychologist specializing in trauma cases. CPS would create a safety plan for our home within 48 hours, with specific guidelines we had to follow. The review hearing got scheduled for 30 days out to check Emma's progress and reassess the situation. He made it clear this was temporary custody only, and any violation of his orders would result in immediate removal of Emma from my care. The court clerk typed everything while Emma kept counting under her breath, now up to 300 and climbing. Judge Harrison signed the order and the bailiff handed copies to both lawyers before calling the next case. We walked out of the courtroom into the hallway where my mother stood by the elevator with her lawyer. She blocked our path and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that she'd be filing a defamation lawsuit against me for the lies I'd told in court. Her lawyer pulled out his phone and started recording while she accused me of breaking into her house and terrorizing an elderly woman in the middle of the night. Georgia grabbed my arm and steered me toward the stairs, whispering that we expected this and to keep walking without responding. Emma pressed against my leg, still counting, now at 400. My mother followed us down the stairs shouting about assault charges and how Marcus would pay for what he'd done to her. Georgia kept pushing me forward through the lobby and out the front doors where the sunlight hit us hard after the dark courtroom. My car was parked 3 blocks away, and Georgia walked with us the whole way, while my mother's threats echoed behind us. Once Emma was buckled in her car seat, Georgia leaned through my window and told me Detective Wilson McCabe from the police department would need to interview me about my mother's complaint. She'd already scheduled it for tomorrow afternoon at 2 and insisted she'd be there for every single question. Her firm had dealt with McCabe before on false accusation cases, and she knew exactly how to handle his interrogation tactics. She reminded me not to discuss anything with anyone except her before tomorrow's interview, especially not with Marcus or anyone else who might have been involved in whatever happened that night. Emma fell asleep on the drive home, her lips still moving with silent numbers even in her sleep. The next afternoon, I sat in the police station interview room with Georgia beside me, while Detective McCabe set up his recording equipment. He was younger than I expected, with careful eyes that watched everything I did from how I sat to where I placed my hands on the table. He started with basic questions about my relationship with my mother and how often Emma stayed at her house for childcare. I explained that my work schedule sometimes required my mother to pick Emma up from the school and keep her until I got off late. He asked about the custody hearing and what led to the emergency petition being filed against me. I told him about discovering Emma's condition when I picked her up and my concerns about her behavior changes. He pressed for details about the night before the hearing, asking where I was and what I did between midnight and 6 a.m. Georgia touched my arm, and I simply stated I was home with my daughter preparing for court the next morning. McCabe showed me photos of my mother's wrists with red marks and asked if I knew how she got those injuries. I said I had no knowledge of any injuries to my mother and remained focused on Emma's safety throughout our conversation. He tried different angles for an hour, asking about Marcus and whether I'd asked anyone to help me with my custody situation. Georgia interrupted several times to redirect the questions back to relevant matters only. When McCabe finally turned off the recorder, he said the investigation would continue, and charges might be filed depending on what evidence they gathered. Georgia thanked him professionally, and we left without another word between us. 2 days later, Marilyn Estrada knocked on my door with a clipboard and a measuring tape for the CPS safety evaluation. She walked through every room taking notes about potential hazards and asking about our daily routines. In the kitchen, she opened every cabinet and removed all the timers, including the microwave timer and the one on the stove. She explained that anything that could trigger Emma's counting response needed to be eliminated from her environment during recovery. She helped me establish new meal routines that didn't involve rigid schedules or rules about finishing food before getting more. Emma watched from the doorway, standing perfectly still with her hands at her sides like a tiny soldier. Marilyn knelt down to Emma's level and told her it was okay to stop counting whenever she wanted without asking permission first. Emma's eyes went wide, but she didn't move or respond, just started counting louder from 800-something. Marilyn made more notes and gave me a printed schedule of required therapy appointments and home visits for the next month. She said Emma's recovery would take time, but the removal of triggers was an important first step. After she left, I found Emma in her room arranging her stuffed animals in perfect rows while counting each one multiple times. 3 days later, we had our first appointment with Jillian Novak, the trauma specialist the court assigned to Emma's case. Her office had soft colors and toys everywhere with no clocks or timers visible anywhere. Emma sat on the floor near my chair for the first 20 minutes just counting while Jillian quietly played with blocks nearby without pushing Emma to join. Then Emma reached for one block and placed it on top of Jillian's tower before pulling her hand back fast. Jillian kept building without making a big deal about it, and Emma added another block a few minutes later. By the end of the session, Emma had played for almost 10 full minutes before returning to her counting. Jillian told me this was actually excellent progress for a first session, and she was optimistic about Emma's ability to recover with consistent therapy. That night, Emma woke up screaming at 2 a.m. again, but this time she only counted to 30 before falling back asleep in my arms. The next 3 nights showed similar improvement with the counting episodes getting shorter each time, though she still woke up scared and sweating. Why did McCabe focus so hard on where I was between midnight and 6 a.m. when nobody's mentioned anything happening during those exact hours? His questions about Marcus helping with the custody situation feel oddly specific too, like he already knows something we haven't heard about yet. I sat with her every single night, not saying much, just being there while she worked through whatever memories haunted her sleep. Some nights were worse than others, but the overall trend was slowly improving from thousands down to hundreds, and now sometimes just dozens. My boss called me into his office the following Monday to discuss my recent absences and late arrivals due to Emma's appointments. I explained the situation and asked about modifying my schedule to accommodate therapy twice a week plus other appointments. He offered me a part-time position with flexible hours, but it meant a 40% pay cut from my current salary. I accepted immediately because Emma's recovery mattered more than money, and I could figure out the finances later somehow. The new schedule let me pick Emma up from the school myself every day and be there for all her appointments without the stress of racing from work. Anton Fowler called that evening to check on Emma's progress since the hearing 2 weeks ago. He'd been reviewing the therapy reports from Jillian and noted improvements in Emma's play engagement and reduction in counting duration. He said Emma still showed concerning scripted behaviors and rigid responses that would take months or maybe years to fully address. He was encouraged by the progress, but wanted me to understand this was a marathon, not a sprint for Emma's healing. He reminded me about the review hearing in 2 more weeks, and said he'd be recommending continued custody with me based on current observations. The relief I felt was mixed with exhaustion from the constant vigilance Emma's care required now. Georgia called the next morning with news that made my stomach drop even though we'd expected it. Detective McCabe had informed her that the prosecutor was considering assault charges against Marcus for the suspected break-in at my mother's house. She was working to separate my legal situation from my brother's, since I hadn't been charged with anything yet. The guilt hit me hard, knowing Marcus might face serious consequences for helping me save Emma from that basement room. Georgia said she'd already connected Marcus with a defense attorney who specialized in military personnel cases, and they were building a strong defense. She reminded me that Marcus made his own choice to help, and I needed to focus on Emma, rather than blame myself for his situation. 2 days later, Marilyn showed up with a thick folder and spent 3 hours going through every room in our house, checking locks on cabinets, looking for timers or anything that might trigger Emma's counting and writing pages of notes about what needed to change. She made me remove the kitchen timer, the alarm clock from Emma's room, and even the microwave beep had to be disabled because Emma would freeze and start whispering numbers whenever she heard any kind of timer sound. Marilyn wrote down rules about meal times, saying Emma could eat whenever she wanted without having to finish everything, and bedtime couldn't have any rigid structure that reminded her of grandmother's lessons. The safety plan filled 12 pages with specific conditions that had to be met before my mother could even be considered for supervised visits at a neutral location with a social worker present, though Marilyn said privately she doubted that would happen for at least a year given what they'd documented. Georgia helped me file for the protective order that same week, and we sat in the courthouse waiting room for 2 hours before the judge called us in, looked at the custody case findings and the photos of Emma's wrists, and signed the temporary order without asking many questions. The paper felt thin in my hands, but Georgia said it meant my mother couldn't come within 500 feet of us, or contact us in any way, and if she tried, the police would arrest her immediately. During Emma's 4th therapy session, Jillian pulled me aside afterward and showed me a list she'd been making of specific phrases that triggered Emma's robotic responses, things like good girls or finish your lessons, that would make Emma go rigid and start her scripted answers. Jillian had a whole plan written out with replacement phrases I could use and ways to slowly change Emma's reactions, starting with just acknowledging when she heard the trigger words without punishing herself for reacting. We practiced in her office with Jillian saying, good girls get rewards, and me immediately saying, all kids deserve love, while Emma colored and after 20 tries, Emma only flinched instead of going completely rigid. The process server knocked on my mother's door the following Tuesday with formal investigation notices from both CPS and the police department, and within hours my phone was blowing up with calls from people at her church asking if it was true she was investigated for child abuse. Half of them called me a liar who was trying to destroy a good woman, but 3 different people called to say they'd always thought something was off. when they saw how still and quiet the kids were during her Sunday school classes, and one woman said she'd seen my mother make a child stand in the corner for 2 hours for spilling juice during a church event 5 years ago. The community split down the middle, with some people starting a prayer circle for my mother, while others finally told stories they'd kept quiet about bruises they'd seen or strange punishments they'd witnessed. At the 30-day review hearing, Judge Harrison read through all the reports from Jillian about Emma's therapy progress, the CPS safety evaluations, and Anton's observations from his weekly check-ins with us. Emma had stopped counting past 100 most nights, and could eat meals without asking permission first, though she still went rigid when she heard certain phrases, and had nightmares that made her wet the bed at least twice a week. The judge kept all the protective orders in place, said he was encouraged by Emma's progress, but concerned about the ongoing trauma responses, and scheduled the next review for 3 months out, instead of the usual monthly check-ins, because he said the pace of recovery couldn't be rushed. That night, I went through my phone and deleted my mother's number, blocked her on every social media platform, and even removed her from my emergency contacts at work and Emma's school. The urge to check what she was posting or saying about me was strong, but every time I started to type her name in a search bar, I forced myself to stop and go check on Emma instead, making snacks or reading stories or just sitting with her while she played with her toys. 2 weeks later, Emma brought me a picture she'd drawn at the school of our house with flowers in the yard and a big sun in the sky. And when I looked closer, I realized there were no tally marks on the walls like she used to draw, no dark rooms with locks, just a normal house with normal windows and a little girl playing outside. She still asked to count before bed, sitting up straight and going through numbers, but now she stopped at 100 instead of trying to reach 10,000, and some nights she only made it to 50 before yawning and asking for a story instead. 3 months had passed when I heard Emma in the backyard laughing at something, and when I looked out the window she was chasing a butterfly around the garden, calling it a flutterby, just like she used to before everything happened. She still had therapy with Jillian twice a week and counting episodes when she got stressed, but hearing that silly made-up word come out of her mouth naturally while she played told me we were finding our way back to who she used to be, one small moment at a time. Well, thanks for sticking around with me through all my questions and those strange turns. It's been really interesting sharing this journey with you all. Catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.